Your favorite villain?
My favorite villain? I kind of like Diddy.
When people say I'm a troll, I say,
I don't know why you're saying I'm trolling people. I'm doing what you've conditioned me to do.
Your favorite villain. That's how 50 Cent described Sean Diddy Combs, a phrase that instantly shifted how the entire documentary would be received. Not as an investigation, not as a reckoning, but as a story already framed around a single character meant to carry the weight of everything. And now, Jaguar Wright is asking why that framing mattered so much.
I can't wait. I can't wait for everybody to find out what's really been going on in the background. Friend, husband, I don't get no.
So you hear about stories of Diddy like shooting people, blowing up cars.
Yeah.
Is he this gangster that?
But
He knew for 30 days that shit was fitting to happen.
Within 24
He could have paid that
hours.
$30 million before.
Yeah, why? Let that hit the fan. Did he?
Because he's Diddy.
He called a bluff?
Because
Because according to her, the documentary didn't fail by lying. It failed by choosing. Choosing what to show, choosing what to repeat, and most importantly, choosing who to leave out. Jaguar says what viewers saw on Netflix was never meant to be the full truth. It was a version carefully shaped, carefully paced, and carefully limited. One that made the audience feel informed, while quietly steering them away from the deeper layers of the story. And that's where the real controversy begins. Before we go any further, answer this honestly in the comments. Do you think 50 Cent exposed the full truth, or was he intentionally spared from the deeper fallout of this story? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want to understand why certain names were never mentioned, and why that silence matters, make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next explains how this narrative was built. According to Jaguar Wright, the moment the documentary ended, something didn't sit right with her. Not because it was poorly made, but because it was too polished, too familiar, too aligned with stories the public had already heard and accepted. She argues that instead of digging deeper, the film leaned on recycled moments and known incidents.
He's have enough money to
he
check.
put the boots to that girl. She's supposed to be a good bitch. No matter who she with. All the time he putting the groom in her. Of course he thought it was still gonna work. He thinks he's God. He ain't doing shit. I raped the fuck out of that bitch, put the boots to her last time I seen her. Her and her trainer, boyfriend, husband. I don't get no.
Scenes that had already circulated. Stories the industry had already learned how to survive. By doing that, she says, the documentary avoided the one thing it promised to deliver: the full scope. In Jaguar's view, this wasn't about uncovering the truth. It was about managing how much truth the audience could handle. That belief pushed her to reach out to someone she felt should have been impossible to exclude from a project like this: Gene Deal, a longtime security insider, someone who wasn't speculating from the outside but observing from within, someone who saw how situations were handled quietly, how pressure worked behind the scenes, and how certain people were protected long before cameras ever arrived. Jaguar says speaking with Gene only confirmed her concerns. According to her, his absence wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Because if the goal was to show how deep this story really goes, leaving out voices like his makes no sense. Unless the intention was to keep the focus narrow, to isolate blame, to stop the conversation from expanding beyond one man. And that's where Jaguar's criticism becomes sharper. She doesn't argue that Diddy shouldn't be held accountable. She argues that he shouldn't be the only one examined, that the documentary framed him as the final destination, when in reality, he may have been operating inside a much larger system that benefited from keeping certain details off camera. In her words, the industry wasn't on trial, Diddy was. And that distinction changes everything. Because once a system decides who will absorb the damage, everyone else gets to step back untouched. Their silence becomes protection, their absence becomes plausible deniability. Jaguar believes this is exactly why the documentary relied so heavily on familiar narratives. By retelling what people already knew, it avoided what people weren't ready to confront. And this is where 50 Cent's role becomes complicated. Jaguar doesn't accuse him of lying. Instead, she questions timing and control. She points out that when the documentary was first announced, Much of the footage later promoted as explosive didn't even exist yet. And yet the project was already being positioned as definitive. So how did that happen? According to her, it felt coordinated, as if the story was decided first and the material was shaped afterward to fit that narrative. Not to deceive viewers outright, but to guide them. That's why she describes the documentary as gaslighting. Not because nothing in it was true, but because the truth was filtered. Viewers were shown just enough to feel informed, while the deeper connections remained out of reach. Jaguar argues that if the complete picture ever came out, not just about Diddy, but about the network around him, the fallout would be massive. Careers would collapse, brands would suffer, entire relationships would come under scrutiny, and that, she believes, is why the story stopped where it did. Blame one man, protect the rest. This framing also explains why certain questions were never asked on screen, why certain names were never spoken, why the documentary focused on personal behavior instead of systemic protection. Because once you widen the lens, the conversation becomes uncontrollable. And according to Jaguar, that's exactly what Netflix wasn't willing to risk. As more people revisit the documentary through this lens, the focus begins to shift away from what was shown and toward what was missing, away from what was said and toward what was carefully avoided. And once viewers start asking why certain voices were excluded, the story stops feeling complete. This isn't about conspiracy theories. It's about omission. And repeated omission, Jaguar argues, is never accidental. This is only the first layer of what she claims was left out. And as the story continues, the attention moves away from Diddy alone and toward the structure that allowed everything to operate the way it did. Because once you stop asking who fell and start asking who stayed standing, the list becomes uncomfortable very fast. What makes Jaguar Wright's claims resonate with so many people isn't just what she's saying, it's what she's pointing away from. Because once you accept the idea that the documentary was shaped to stop at a certain point, the next logical question becomes unavoidable. What happens if the story goes further? According to Jaguar, that's exactly the line that was never crossed. She argues that the documentary positioned itself as bold, while staying inside boundaries the industry already knows how to manage. Familiar incidents, familiar faces, familiar outrage. Enough to shock viewers, but not enough to destabilize the system that allowed everything to exist in the first place. And this is where the idea of a real list begins to take shape. Jaguar doesn't describe it as a literal document passed around in secret. She describes it as an unspoken understanding, a mental map of names, relationships, and protections that never make it on screen. People who were present, people who benefited, people whose silence mattered. In her view, Diddy didn't operate alone. He operated within permission. Permission that came from power, money, influence, and shared risk. This is why she believes focusing entirely on one person creates a false sense of closure. It gives the audience someone to point at, someone to blame, someone to feel resolved about while everything else remains untouched. And that's exactly why she says the documentary feels incomplete rather than dishonest. Jaguar explains that if the full scope were shown, it wouldn't just change opinions about Diddy. It would force uncomfortable questions about how the industry works, who decides what gets buried, and how many people quietly cooperate to keep certain truths from surfacing. That's not a story platforms like to tell, because that kind of exposure doesn't end with one career. It ripples outward. This is where Gene Deal's role becomes central again. According to Jaguar, Gene wasn't just another voice who could add color to the narrative. He represented continuity, someone whose account stretches across eras, relationships, and moments that never reached headlines. Someone who saw how crises were handled internally long before they ever reached the public. And when someone like that is missing from a full reckoning, it raises questions that are hard to dismiss. Jaguar claims Gene told her he chose not to participate once it became clear that creative control wasn't where the audience assumed it was. That while 50 Cent's name led the project, final decisions about what stayed and what disappeared were not his to make. If that's true, it reframes everything. Because it means the documentary wasn't just telling a story, it was negotiating one. Negotiating tone, negotiating depth, negotiating consequences. And once negotiation enters the process, truth becomes conditional. Jaguar believes this explains why certain themes were emphasized while others vanished entirely. Why viewers were shown moments of personal chaos, but not the infrastructure that absorbed and redirected that chaos over time. Why behavior was highlighted, but protection was not. This isn't about editing for time. It's about editing for survival. She also questions timing not just of the documentary's release, but of what followed. Why certain footage surfaced when it did. Why some material appeared only after legal windows had closed. Why revelations arrived when accountability had already shifted out of reach. To Jaguar, this didn't feel accidental. It felt strategic. And strategy implies coordination. That's why she pushes back against the idea that the documentary was an act of courage. In her view, courage would have meant naming names. Courage would have meant following the money. Courage would have meant showing how deeply interconnected everything really was. Instead, she says, viewers were given a controlled burn, enough fire to distract, not enough to destroy. This perspective also explains why Jaguar is so critical of how public reaction unfolded. She argues that outrage was directed exactly where it was meant to go, toward one individual, toward personal behavior, toward moral condemnation. All important conversations, but incomplete ones. Because while the audience focused on the villain, the system remained invisible. And systems thrive in invisibility. Jaguar repeatedly emphasizes that this isn't about excusing Diddy, it's about refusing to let accountability stop with him. She insists that isolating one person allows everyone else to reset, rebrand, and move on as if nothing happened. And history shows that's exactly what often happens. The industry condemns loudly, distances quickly, and then quietly continues operating the same way. Which is why Jaguar says, the most dangerous thing about the documentary isn't what it showed, it's what it allowed people to stop asking. Once viewers feel they've seen the truth, curiosity shuts down, investigation ends, pressure fades. And that, she argues, is the real outcome. She also questions why certain figures, despite being deeply embedded in the same environment, never faced the same scrutiny. Why their proximity never translated into accountability. Why their silence was accepted as neutrality instead of complicity. These aren't accusations, they're observations. And observations, when repeated across years and witnesses, start to feel heavier than opinions. Jaguar believes the industry understands this well. That's why exposure is always measured. That's why stories are framed carefully. That's why some doors remain permanently closed. Because once the audience sees the full map, there's no easy way to fold it back up. As this conversation spreads, more people are revisiting the documentary with fresh eyes. Not rewatching for shock, but for gaps, for moments that feel unfinished, for transitions that abruptly move on when things get uncomfortable. And those gaps are starting to speak. They're forcing viewers to ask whether what they saw was the truth or just the part that could safely be released. This is the tension now hanging over the story. Not whether Diddy deserves accountability, but whether stopping there allows everyone else to escape it. And as Jaguar continues to speak out, that tension only grows. Because once you suggest that the story was shaped to protect more than it exposed, you can't unring that bell. The audience starts listening differently. And once that happens, the narrative no longer belongs to the documentary. It belongs to the questions it left behind. As those questions begin to spread, the focus subtly shifts again, this time away from what the documentary chose to include, and toward why certain people seemed untouchable, no matter how much scrutiny intensified. Jaguar Wright argues that this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable for everyone involved. Because once you accept that the story was narrowed on purpose, you're forced to confront a deeper reality. Selective exposure requires selective protection. Someone decides where the spotlight stops. Someone decides which connections are too dangerous to examine publicly. And those decisions are rarely moral. They're strategic. According to Jaguar, the idea that one documentary could fully expose a system this entrenched was never realistic. Not because the information didn't exist, but because revealing it would have required confronting people and entities with far more leverage than one individual artist or executive. This is why she keeps returning to the same point. Diddy became the end point when he should have been the entry point. From her perspective, the documentary presented him as the central problem, rather than as a product of an environment that rewarded excess, silence, and loyalty above all else. By doing so, it allowed everyone else to reposition themselves as shocked observers instead of long-term participants. Jaguar believes that repositioning was the real victory, because once the industry successfully reframes itself as disturbed bystander rather than enabler, the pressure dissipates. Conversations shift from who allowed this to how did this happen, and accountability becomes abstract instead of specific. She also questions how quickly public narratives aligned. Within days of the documentary's release, statements echoed similar language. Outrage was expressed in carefully measured terms. Condemnations were issued without context. And notably, very few people acknowledged their own proximity to the environment being criticized. To Jaguar, this uniformity wasn't organic. It felt rehearsed. She points out that when genuine disruption occurs, reactions are chaotic, conflicting stories emerge, panic leaks through, silence breaks unevenly. But here, the response felt controlled, almost synchronized. And control suggests coordination. This is where the idea of being spared becomes central to her argument. Jaguar doesn't claim that 50 Cent was part of a cover-up. Instead, she suggests that his position within the industry afforded him a unique kind of insulation. By focusing the narrative outward rather than inward, he avoided becoming entangled in the deeper reckoning that a truly unfiltered documentary might have triggered. In other words, he told a version of the story that could exist without detonating everything around it. That distinction matters, because telling some truth can be far more effective than telling all truth, especially when the goal is to appear transparent while maintaining stability. Jaguar believes this is why the documentary leaned heavily on personal behavior instead of institutional patterns. Why it emphasized individual wrongdoing without interrogating how that wrongdoing was tolerated, facilitated, or ignored for years. Institutions prefer stories with villains. They struggle with stories about systems. And systems are exactly what Jaguar insists need to be examined. She argues that environments like the one surrounding Diddy don't survive on secrecy alone. They survive on normalization. On people convincing themselves that what they're seeing is temporary, isolated, or someone else's responsibility. Over time, that mindset hardens into culture. And culture is far harder to dismantle than reputation. This is why she believes so many people who were present stayed silent, not out of fear alone, but out of dependency. Careers were built, access was granted, money flowed. Speaking up meant losing more than status. It meant losing identity. Jaguar says the documentary never truly confronted this reality. Instead, it showed consequences without fully examining complicity. It showed outcomes without tracing inputs. It showed collapse without mapping construction. And that's where the narrative begins to feel incomplete. As viewers sit with these ideas, another question surfaces naturally. If the story had gone deeper, who else would have been implicated? Jaguar never provides a definitive list. And that's intentional. Because naming names without airtight evidence would undermine her argument. Instead, she focuses on consistency, on patterns, on repeated behaviors across time, people, and platforms. She points out that many of the same figures who distanced themselves publicly had previously praised, collaborated with, or defended the very culture now being condemned. That contradiction isn't proof of wrongdoing, but it is proof of selective memory. And selective memory is a survival skill in powerful circles. This is also why Jaguar is skeptical of how quickly some people position themselves as advocates for victims after the documentary aired. She questions whether those gestures represented genuine reflection or simply damage control. Because true reckoning requires sacrifice. It requires admitting complicity. It requires accepting consequences. It requires staying in uncomfortable conversations long after public attention fades. From her perspective, the documentary didn't demand any of that. It allowed people to condemn safely. And safety, she argues, is the enemy of truth. As this interpretation gains traction, it changes how people engage with the documentary retroactively. Scenes that once felt conclusive now feel transitional. Endings that once felt resolved now feel premature. The audience begins to sense that they were brought to the edge of something and then turned around. That sensation lingers. It doesn't erupt into outrage immediately. It settles into suspicion, into quiet doubt, into the feeling that there's more beneath the surface than what was shown. And those feelings don't disappear easily. Jaguar understands this well. That's why she continues to speak in implications rather than accusations. She isn't trying to replace one narrative with another. She's trying to reopen a conversation that was prematurely closed. Because once a story is labeled complete, curiosity dies. And curiosity is the one thing systems fear most. As the pressure builds and more people revisit the documentary through this lens, the original framing begins to crack. Not dramatically, subtly. Viewers start noticing who wasn't interviewed, which timelines were compressed, which transitions felt abrupt, which questions were never asked. And in those absences, the story expands. Not with new footage, but with new awareness. This is the moment Jaguar has been pushing toward all along. The moment when the audience stops consuming the story as entertainment and starts interrogating it as structure. Because once that shift happens, the documentary is no longer the final word. It becomes the opening argument. And arguments, unlike conclusions, invite response. As this story continues to evolve, the pressure no longer rests solely on Diddy or on the documentary itself. It spreads outward toward the networks, platforms, and power brokers who decide how far truth is allowed to travel. And that pressure is only beginning to be felt. Because when enough people start asking the same unanswered questions, silence stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling deliberate. By the time the conversation reaches this point, something important has already changed. The story is no longer about whether Jaguar Wright is right or wrong. It's no longer even about whether the documentary succeeded or failed. What's changed is how people are listening. Because once the idea takes hold that a story may have been managed rather than fully told, every detail gets re-examined. Every omission feels louder. Every carefully chosen moment starts to look intentional. And that's exactly where the final layer of Jaguar's argument lands. She says the most revealing thing about the documentary isn't what it shows, it's what happened after it aired. The rapid shift in tone, the coordinated outrage, the immediate repositioning of key voices who suddenly wanted to be seen on the right side of history. To her, that response confirmed what she already suspected. Because when a system feels genuinely threatened, it doesn't respond with statements and distance. It responds with silence, confusion, and fracture. What she saw instead was alignment. A collective agreement on where the blame should land and where it shouldn't travel. And that's why she keeps returning to one uncomfortable idea. Containment. Not denial, not defense. Containment. The story was allowed to exist, but only within boundaries that kept it from spreading outward. Viewers were given enough truth to feel shocked, but not enough to feel destabilized. Enough outrage to vent, but not enough clarity to demand structural change. That's not an accident. That's design. Jaguar argues that this is how power protects itself in the modern era. Not by hiding everything, but by releasing controlled truth. Truth that satisfies curiosity without provoking collapse. And this is where the title of the conversation finally makes sense. Why was 50 Cent spared? Not because he was innocent, not because he was complicit, but because he served a purpose. He became the face of exposure without becoming the subject of it. He delivered a narrative that could be accepted, distributed, and monetized without forcing the industry to look too closely at itself. In other words, he was positioned safely outside the blast radius. Jaguar doesn't say this with bitterness. She says it with clarity. Because she understands how narratives move through powerful spaces. She understands how platforms operate. She understands how much money, reputation, and stability are tied to keeping certain conversations theoretical rather than specific. This is why she warns people not to confuse visibility with transparency. Just because something is shown doesn't mean it's fully revealed. Just because a story is loud doesn't mean it's complete. And just because a villain is named doesn't mean the system that empowered him has been dismantled. As the dust settles, this is the question that remains hanging in the air. What happens now? Jaguar believes the danger is that people will mistake this moment for closure, that they'll assume accountability has been served because someone has fallen, that they'll move on without asking why the conditions that allowed everything to happen still exist. History suggests that's exactly what usually happens. One person absorbs the consequences, the system adapts, the cycle continues, but this time, something feels different. Because too many people are noticing the gaps. They're noticing the names that never came up. They're noticing the timelines that jump forward too quickly. They're noticing the voices that were never invited to speak. And once enough people start noticing the same absences, those absences become the story. This is the point Jaguar has been trying to reach all along. Not to replace one narrative with another, but to prevent the narrative from closing prematurely. She doesn't ask people to believe her blindly. She asks them to stay curious, to resist the comfort of neat endings, to understand that systems rarely collapse in one moment, they erode when attention stays focused longer than expected. Because attention is the one thing power can't fully control. As more documentaries, interviews, and counter-stories begin to emerge, the original framing will continue to be tested. Some claims will hold, others won't. But the most important shift has already occurred. People are no longer asking, "Is this true?" They're asking, "Why was this the version we were given?" And that question doesn't go away easily. It lingers, it spreads, it invites scrutiny. Which is why this story isn't ending with one documentary, one reaction, or one viral clip. It's entering a phase where the audience is no longer satisfied with surface-level reckoning. They want structure. They want context. They want accountability that doesn't stop at the most convenient place. Whether or not that accountability ever arrives remains to be seen. But one thing is clear. Once the audience stops accepting curated truth as complete truth, the balance of power shifts, even if only slightly. And slight shifts are how real change begins. If you've made it to the end of this video, you already understand that this story is bigger than one man, one platform, or one documentary. It's about how narratives are built, how blame is assigned, and how systems protect themselves when exposure gets too close. So now, I want to hear from you. Where do you think this story goes next? Do you believe the full picture will ever come out, or will it always stop just short of the truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Because this conversation isn't over, it's just reached the point where it can't be ignored anymore.